Joined in the studio by Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst and former Europe and Middle East Editor at the Associated Press. Thanks for being with us, Dan. The UN Security Council then failed to pass yet another resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. So the fighting continues, as we saw inside the Gaza Strip. How long does Israel have in terms of US support?
Not forever. The U.S. does not want this war escalating and continuing and costing Biden politically, at least the White House doesn't, well into 2024. So they've made statements. Blinken has made statements, speaking of weeks, not months, and so forth. I think the big issue is the very issue that Israelis don't seem to like to have be emphasized, which is the civilian casualties. You know, an intelligent person is able to have more than one narrative in their mind at the same time. It's not enough to say, look, our narrative is that Hamas is terrible and they fire from mosques and they hide rifles and teddy bears. That's clearly a reasonable narrative. But there's another narrative that says that you can't fight this at any cost without limit to the damage to civilians. And so the more civilians are killed in Gaza, the more that window of opportunity for Israel diminishes and eventually shall close, because the U.S. will probably move more aggressively in its insistences that Israel do something differently. I think Biden would like for Israel to eradicate Hamas, for sure. Almost all reasonable people on the planet would like that, but not at the cost of a year of fighting and constant damage to civilians and never-ending death tolls on both sides, by the way.
And there is a high cost to Israel as well. Nearly 100 IDF soldiers have fallen in the fight.
I said on both sides. I do think there are things that Israel could do if it wanted to keep that window open, and this has to do with very basic strategic calculations and also messaging. Can you imagine what would happen, for example, if the Israeli Prime Minister held a news conference, spoke for 10 minutes, and it was covered by everyone on the planet, and he basically said, we don't want to occupy Gaza, and we're not going anywhere. And these jihadis that have taken hold of Gaza are bad for the Palestinians, bad for Israel, bad for the Arabs, and bad for the world. So we want to offer you a deal. And that deal is that, yes, our only possible hope is partition when we are rid of Hamas. And we will, with the Americans and the Arabs and anyone else who wants to help, pull together a development fund worth as much or more than a Marshall Plan in Europe, because we want to be your friend and help you build airports and infrastructure and harbors and so forth.
But can that be done while Hamas is still functioning?
This is my very point. What we need right now is pressure on Hamas to lay down their arms or to flee, basically. And I think that's an option, the Beirut scenario from 1982. Imagine if they said, all this awaits you, including a road to statehood, if Hamas lays down their arms or agrees to flee. And if that happens, then the war is over today. Now, an Israel that says that would, A, be a more moral Israel, B, have a bigger window of legitimacy than the one we currently contend with.
Given what you know, do you think that it is possible to entirely defeat Hamas, you know, as not just as a group, but as an idea, as an ideology, and for Gazans to embrace a different, peaceful future?
It is possible, I believe, militarily to defeat Hamas. I believe the ideological conflict with Hamas is a longer-term process because it involves countering nearly a generation of brainwashing in media, mosques, and schools. But that is possible because there are a lot of Gazans who want a different future. A lot of Gazan parents who have been afraid of the brainwashing and what it would do to their children. And if there is a credible post-Hamas reconstruction effort that may involve Israel and multiple allies, there are a lot of Gazans who would support it.
Joseph Brady at the Centre for Peace Communication. Great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Well, Dan Perry's with me in the studio. Dan, fascinating to hear that, you know, it has been incredibly dangerous for civilians in Gaza to speak out against Hamas, but they do appear to be doing so more and more.
The entire logic behind Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip was to compel the Gazan people to overthrow Hamas, and that has obviously failed spectacularly. And I doubt very much that it's going to happen anytime soon. But this would be kind of a black swan event if somehow in southern Gaza, almost unbidden and unexpectedly, the population would do something real against Hamas. But as for public opinion in Gaza, I strongly urge that we ignore almost everything coming out, because police states that are as brutal as Hamas is create a situation where people cannot express themselves in any way that is real. Same in Russia today. I remember arriving in Romania in 1990, weeks after Ceausescu was overthrown. Everyone hated the communists. You couldn't find one defender, but the same people told me, if you had asked us a month ago, we would pretend that we did. So what are you going to do with that situation?
As well,
of course in Iran. Obviously, these poor people that have lived under these satanic and diabolical jihadi regimes would love to be rid of them. And I can only bemoan the imbeciles in the West that protest for Hamas completely misconstruing the situation and thinking that somehow helps the Palestinians. It's intellectually vapid and morally empty.
I just want to go back to your point about how Israel could be doing more to protect civilians in Gaza. We just heard from Pierre there, and we were talking about the army does appear to be going to great pains to spare civilian life in Gaza, much more than any other army. But this is an enemy determined to embed itself inside civilian infrastructure and cause as many civilian casualties as possible. That's one of its weapons, isn't it, to get the international community to rein Israel in?
There's absolutely no question that that is true. It was also clear that the plan of Hamas in Iran was to get Israel to move in with tanks and bombardments and cause civilian casualties, because that is how demonic they are. They somehow see that as helpful to them. No doubt that this is a challenge, but that doesn't mean you have to blunder into it and do just what they hope for.
You think it's been
I think that Israel has not done enough to message everything it's doing to minimize the civilian casualties, yes. Israel, somewhat arrogantly, after the horrible Hamas massacre, thought it had carte blanche, and it now discovers it doesn't, and it was predictable that it wouldn't. So
because the troops sat and waited, didn't they, outside Gaza? Everybody was saying, when will there be a ground
offensive? What I'm saying is a bigger messaging effort should have been made to ensure that no one could possibly claim that Israel is engaged in a punitive counter-massacre. And that's a narrative that's taking hold. Now, Israel knows how to do PR and it wants to. In this case, someone fell down on the job, and the result is visible, not just in a publicity problem, but a strategic problem.
Do you think the military offensive has been a failure?
Look, I've heard it argued that it'll be studied as a huge success in military academies all over the world, largely because they succeeded in moving populations around to minimize the potential damage, and that much is true. It's too early to say.
Do you lay any of the blame with the Arab countries who refuse to take any Palestinians?
Absolutely. The Arab countries for decades have gotten away with duplicity of an almost comical nature, where we all know what they think privately, and then they do lip service to the likes of Hamas even. I would like to see the Arab League come out with a statement that supports the Palestinians and calls for a two-state solution, but makes crystal clear that they consider Hamas to be the enemy of the Arab and Islamic worlds. And they haven't done so because they fear their street. And honestly, if there's one useful thing about dictators, is that they maybe don't have to fear the street quite so much. Be brave for once and speak the truth. That might help the Arab League be useful, perhaps for the first time in its history.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. Dan Perry there.